Good afternoon. This is Shan Dunn with Altair Global. Welcome, and thank you for attending today's webinar, A Beginner's Guide to Global Compensation. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to address a few housekeeping items. Altair has submitted this webinar to Worldwide ERC for 1 CRP recertification credit and also to the Human Resources Certification Institute for 1 hour of general HR credit. Both ERC and HRCI use a self-service model for submitting credit, and we have included the activity IDs and instructions on how to request credit on the continuing education slide in the presentation handout sent before the webinar. If you didn't receive this handout, please let us know in the question and answer window, and we'll make sure you receive a copy. There's also a continuing education slide in this presentation, and I'll go over that briefly at the end. Please be advised that your phones have been muted by our phone system. If you have questions during the presentation, please submit them in the question and answer window on your screen. We'll try to respond to each question at the end of the broadcast. Our speakers today bring a wealth of knowledge and insight to our broadcast. As Altair's, sorry folks, slides have a hitch in their giddy up. As Altair's Vice President of Global Consulting Services, Mary Beth Nitz is responsible for all aspects of our internal global consulting services team. Her role includes being well-versed and knowledgeable on a wide range of mobility topics, including global compensation. Now, speaking of global compensation, we're fortunate to have Susan Myers, our Vice President of Global Compensation, on our call today. Susan is responsible for all aspects of Altair's global compensation programs. Her extensive background in accounting, tax, and of course global compensation makes her the perfect resource for our broadcast today. With that, let's get started with Mary Beth Nitz, who's going to go over the basics of global compensation before we take a deeper dive into the topic. Mary Beth?
Thank you, Shan, and thank you to everybody that's joining us today. We're very happy to have you with us. First thing I want to do is go over somewhat of our agenda for the day and the key topics that we're going to touch on. First, we're going to go through some key global compensation terms you may have heard quite a few times in your daily work lives. Just make sure we have an understanding of what all of those terms mean. So we're going to talk a little bit about the process of identifying stakeholders in the global compensation spectrum. We're going to talk about the basics of data collection as well as reporting obligations, and that will tie well into compliance in both the home and the host countries. And then finally at the end, we'll work on bringing everyone together, make sure everybody's on the same page when we get to the end of setting up our global compensation process. So let's start with some of the key terms that we hear within the global compensation space. We hear many of these terms on a regular basis, often from our clients asking for clarification and details on what some of these actually mean. One of the terms I seem to be asked a lot about is the term remuneration, which is actually a term that is used quite often in the global mobility space. Hypothetical tax and shadow payroll are other terms that you might hear regularly, but how many of us actually know what these terms mean? Well, Susan is going to give us some insight into that and help us define these terms. Susan?
Thanks, Mary Beth. We've included key words on the slide because they are core to your expatriate compensation program and because each of the words on this slide create some confusion when you are getting started. As you get started building your international assignment policy, the first term you're probably going to hear is the balance sheet concept. In simplified terms, the balance sheet methodology is a home country-based approach to compensation which creates a series of allowances that focus on the difference in cost between the home and the host country. The goal is to protect the purchasing power of the home country's salary, allowing the assignee to maintain the same financial living standard had they never gone on assignment. Hypothetical tax is another key term that you'll often hear, and it can be sometimes very confusing. It's a pre-tax deduction retained from the assignee's pay and calculated to mirror the taxes the employee would have paid had they never gone on assignment. The confusion is often around what happens to this deduction. The deduction is not really a tax withholding remitted to a taxing authority. Instead, it's applied against the tax cost paid by the company. Tax equalization, or TEQ, something you may hear quite a bit for short, really goes hand in hand with hypothetical tax. The process of tax equalization ensures tax costs incurred by an assignee are equal to the amount of tax that the employee would have paid had they never gone on assignment. Hypothetical tax is deducted throughout the year. Tax returns are completed both with and without assignment-related income. Tax owed without assignment-related income is the amount of tax the employee is expected to pay. The hypothetical tax is expected to cover that amount due from the employee. The challenge is created when the hypothetical tax isn't sufficient to cover that tax due. The assignee now owes the company money, which creates extra work for everyone and certainly can create dissatisfaction from the employee side. Another term, shadow payroll, describes the process. Basically, shadow payroll is a ghost or memo payroll run in host countries when employees are required to pay tax on income via payroll withholding as the income is earned or provided by taxable fringe benefits. The confusion for some is the shadow payroll term may be used interchangeably with support provided by a local tax provider who would help in remitting foreign tax due in countries where a true shadow payroll isn't required to be run.
So Susan, you've hit on some of the terms that we see on the slide. One that I'm interested in, and I'm sure a lot of our attendees are as well, is the term trailing liabilities. Where and when do you most often hear questions regarding trailing liabilities?
On the accounting side, Mary Beth, we get questions around trailing liabilities almost every month. Trailing liabilities are quite simply costs that continue to arise from time to time after the assignee has repatriated. The confusion and really the challenge is on the financial and business side, where the expectation is that costs are going to stop hitting the financial ledger now that the employee has returned from assignment. As you develop your program, spending some time with the financial team, helping them understand the flow of costs, especially tax costs, which can hit long after the assignee has left the country, will be a big benefit to the organization if you can invest the time.
Great, thank you, Susan. So now let's talk about how we get started. Let's just say hypothetically that you are a corporation that runs a mainly U.S. domestic program, but you're just starting to see more and more international moves. So let's talk a little bit about how do we get started on the right path with regards to global compensation.
Well, we highly recommend taking the time to ensure you build a program that's aligned with the greater organization to avoid problems as early as possible and making sure that they don't develop in the future. We found one of the biggest challenges occur when someone important to the process is unaware, or maybe worse, decisions are made that impact downstream processes without considering the bigger picture. So to avoid these types of missteps, we always recommend taking the time to identify and bring together key process owners. The list of participants is always going to be specific to your business, but in general, we like to recommend bringing payroll, corporate tax, the international tax provider, your relocation service provider, legal, business unit leads, finance teams to the table early to really ensure the broadest perspective and diversity of ideas as you begin building out your compensation compliance program. So we talk about the who, we talk about payroll teams as an example, really critical to delivering allowances on a worldwide basis. They may need to set up new earnings codes, which can take some time. They may need to establish a process to deliver the benefit instructions and a process to ensure that benefits are being paid accurately while updating wages and taxable income that's paid outside of payroll into the W-2 from a U.S. perspective as an example. All of those are really critical processes, and their input is going to be really important. Corporate tax must be aware of employee movement as they start seeing cross-border activity. Depending upon the type of work your newly mobile employees are doing, permanent establishment risk might be an issue and concern. Unfortunately, you could create tax implications for the organization simply because you haven't brought the right people to the table. Your legal and immigration teams, they'll direct you on employment law and any requirements for doing business legally within each country. Their guidance can really be essential as you're getting up off the ground. We like to say bringing the business leads and the financial teams together will help as they start seeing the added costs hit their P&L. And while they're often the catalyst for the transfers or the assignments, most won't really understand the true cost of the move without some support and education. So keeping them involved for budgeting and accrual planning definitely will greatly help you in the long run to deliver a successful program.
So another bullet that I see on the slide is international tax partner. I know this is a question that from the consulting perspective we get a lot from our clients. So Susan, how important is it to establish a relationship with an international tax partner, and how early should this relationship be established?
Well, my opinion, an international tax provider really needs to be one of the very first calls you make unless you have an international tax specialist in-house. The tax provider will have a team that's ready to guide your organization through the questions regarding those permanent establishment issues, cross-charging, employment law, visa and immigration. So I look to the international tax partner as a key consultant as your team begins building out the right set of processes to manage risk and really help ensure compliance.
Well, thank you for validating that from a global consulting perspective, we are directing our clients to do the right thing at the right time. So now I believe we have our first polling question. And our first polling question is, what is hypothetical tax? Clearly we are testing each of you to see if you've been listening. The possible answers are A, a deduction made each pay cycle, B, tax deduction due as if the assignee hadn't gone on assignment, C, credit against assignment tax costs paid by the company, or D, all of the above. And you can use the voting button on your screen to vote in the poll. This is great. We have a lot of smart people on the phone. It looks like the majority of our attendees today picked D, all of the above, and that is indeed the correct answer to our first polling question. So we're going to see really how smart everybody is. We're going to go right into polling question number 2. And that question is, shadow payroll is best described as A, paying the employee in cash off the books, B, a taxable income update on host country payroll, C, paying assignment allowances in the host country, or D, all of the above. Well, this is great. We also have ethical attendees on the line today. We clearly were not able to stump you with the answer A, which was paying the employee in cash off the books. As you'll see, the majority of our listeners selected B, a taxable income update on host country payroll, and that is the correct answer.
Okay, so it's time to take control, and we want to really talk about the basics of data collection. You can see there are quite a few data sources for compensation collection just by a quick look at the slide. In most situations, each country will have a different contact for each data type unless your operations are very small or startup. Some countries may have multiple contacts for the same data type based upon your corporate structure. So before you get started building out the right process, we suggest you sit down and focus on identifying all of the compensation data elements associated with the program. Once you take a look at all of the data items that need to be collected, the next step is really to outline who owns the data in each location. So think in terms of primary and secondary backup contacts as well. This task is going to be only a very small portion of the collection contact's regular duties. Having a backup who can be of assistance when someone is involved in a large project or out on leave will help facilitate consistent reporting. This approach also helps mitigate the risk that someone will move on to a new role and that there'll be a knowledge gap or a need for additional training. Depending upon the country, any gap in time where data isn't properly reported could create a compliance risk.
Thanks, Susan. That's great. You mentioned the word owner, obviously, a couple times on this slide. Tell us, how important is it really to identify an owner, per se, for each of these individual data points?
I think it's absolutely essential, Mary Beth. If there isn't an owner, you're going to lose time and lose traction in accountability over data reporting, and you'll very quickly find yourself with data gaps, especially given the tighter and tighter compliance in the host country relating to shadow payroll. So there's a very tight window for data that must be collected and then turned around and reported to the contacts in the host country if you're going to keep a consistent compliance reporting program.
And so while we're on the subject of collecting the data, let's talk a little bit about compliance in home and host countries. And Susan, correct me if I'm wrong, but looking at this, I think this is where it's really important not to have too much of a U.S.-centric view or approach with regards to the timing and frequency of the data collection. Can you expand on that for us?
Sure. We've talked a bit about establishing that local owner for each compensation element. Creating the right business process becomes the next challenge. So we recommend you are rolling out a program that you consider collecting data really on a monthly basis. Collecting monthly allows you to coordinate data with a payroll and tax provider in both the home and host country on a pretty routine calendar. Collecting monthly also allows you to avoid that U.S.-centric quarterly collection of data that can be confusing outside of the United States. Personal income tax reporting outside of the U.S. doesn't always fall on a calendar year basis, which makes it really difficult to align quarters and tax reporting due dates when in the home country tax reporting may be due at 12/31, and in the host country it could be 3/31 or it could be 6/30. So being much more routine about it allows you to get that data in and make sure it's whole and it's reconciled. From my perspective, one of the biggest challenges with data collection is not also the what, but it's really the how. So how do you get all of this data collected and aggregated around the globe? My perspective is you really need a tool to work this efficiently, or you need a business partner who can handle the work for you. If your program is very small, an Excel workbook is still a very feasible approach. You'll find once you have more than 5 or 6 assignments that must be tracked and require monthly reporting, and the process starts to become pretty labor intensive. As the owner of Global Mobility, it's likely you'll be tasked with finding the right resource. Typically early on, someone in corporate finance or accounting may be that right person, as they'll have visibility into the general ledger and cost data. Another option is someone within the payroll group. The challenge becomes the global coordination, multiple currencies, time zones. So how do I reach out and get a hold of someone in the evening when I have a full workload during the day? I recommend you discuss your options early with your RMC and your tax provider to find a solution that really best fits your organization.
So that really takes us back to the point of the importance of establishing that relationship with the tax provider, but also ensuring that the tax provider and your RMC are working really closely together.
Absolutely.
Okay, so what do we do with all this data? So let's say now we have a calendar. We've established the timing for data collection. So now what do we do with all of this data?
The data needs to be reported to your key compliance contacts in the home and host country. So typically data needs to be reported to the host country payroll or the tax provider on a monthly basis. There can be significant coordination work around pulling together all the data to meet the timeline of the host country. Once the host country has processed their shadow payroll or made their local income tax filing, those taxes that are paid into the local tax scheme become taxable income, and they must be reported as income to the home country. So your home country payroll teams will advise how often they want to make an update for wages or update to wages for taxable income that were paid either directly to the assignee or on behalf of the employee, depending upon the duration of the assignment, Benefits can include pre-assignment costs, home finding, settling in, ongoing housing costs, transportation, home leave, family support, education. So, you have to be really careful not to duplicate the reporting, making sure you get all of that data into the system. The organization may not have always paid the employee directly, so it gets quite complicated in making sure that all of the information is available in a ready format. The gross of taxes, the taxes that are paid for the assignment-related income, that becomes income as well. So it becomes the tax-on-tax business process. Once that data is collected, it's properly included in income in the home country and in the host country. You've just begun, really, because now the tax return still has to be completed. The tax provider will secure all that personal information from the assignee through the organizer process, but they're still going to need the details behind the income that's been reported into wages at both the home and host country. On the U.S. side, if the payroll team has created wage codes for each of the benefits versus a single taxable relocation bucket, then possibly you can provide a W-2 analysis report by wage code that can be used for tax preparation. You probably would be in pretty good shape. But you'll need to provide a detailed report to the host country tax provider contact to support either the shadow payroll or local filings. If your program is small, an Excel-based report will work, but remember to be consistent with your exchange rate process. So providing the date paid, the amount, the currency to the local tax provider is really important. As your program grows, you'll likely find that the administrative work to collection, manage, and reporting becomes pretty big of a risk if you keep doing it manually. Speak with your support providers, the RMC and the tax provider. Both are going to have options that can meet your needs.
So let's talk a little bit, Susan, about the annual tax preparation process. A term we hear a lot in our industry is year-end. We often see our friends from global compensation and accounting walking around with very weary looks on their faces. So talk to us a little bit about what the annual tax preparation process looks like.
Well, we like to tell our team here that year-end is just another payroll pass. And by and large, it really is if you have the right process in place. I think that's really key. If you fall behind on your collection, if you have data gaps, year-end becomes quite a pressure environment for everyone. It also can be costly to the organization because you can't be sure that you've collected all of the data, and until those host country tax returns start getting prepared, it's often possible that you're going to identify additional income and you're going to have to restate your W-2. And so the more often you bring that data in on a monthly basis, the rigor around and updating wages, that really ensures that year-end does really become just another payroll pass.
So that's really the end goal then.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I think we are ready for our third polling question. Alrighty, and this question is, what is the best approach to starting a global compensation and compliance program? A, ask payroll and tax teams for guidance. B, wait until year-end to collect all the required data. C, identify key stakeholders and establish a structured policy. Or D, all of the above. Okay, that's great. Once again, applause to our attendees. The correct answer was C, identify key stakeholders and establish a structured policy. And the majority of our listeners today selected that as the correct answer. So now we're going to talk about maybe what I think could be one of the biggest challenges, and that's bringing the organization together. So we've gone through this process. We've checked the boxes. We've talked about the data collection points. And let's say we've established that process and identified the key stakeholders. So now here's the challenge. How do we implement this across the organization?
To me, gaining leadership buy-in is critical. So I mentioned earlier that staying compliant will take a lot of stakeholder involvement. This extra work will not be a full-time job of anybody, most likely anyway. Possibly even the global mobility manager is going to wear multiple hats. So someone will need to emphasize the importance of joining the effort and reporting data timely. Adding that additional work into their payroll and finance processes, it's really critical that someone in the leadership level really back that effort and make a bold statement regarding compliance. From your payroll and tax teams, they will really help you develop that compliance message. They'll already probably have a lot of insight into the organization's goals in that area. They're going to advise on risk and the company's requirements for updating wages. Once everybody's aligned, it's really about communicating the new process and why it's so important to the organization. Establishing an overall owner who coordinates within the organization will help you ensure that the work is being done. You know, there are a lot of moving parts, so I think that's just a very critical step.
So when you refer to an owner, an overall owner of this process, to me it sounds like a pretty daunting task. So talk a little bit more about what you mean by an overall owner.
Sure. So rolling out that processes and or the processes and establishing contacts and creating a master calendar, they allow for ease in administration. Everybody agrees to do X by a certain date and expectations are clear. You built the model, you've established your contacts and processes, and it's time to go live, and then what happens next? And everybody gets very bogged down in the day-to-day. And so an overall owner should really develop that tracking methodology, which quickly lets you know if gaps are occurring, when people might miss their scheduled reporting. With the right follow-up and updates, you know, you can have enough visibility to really be comfortable that the process is working. So from time to time, asking to see the information, you test the data to make sure it's complete and that everything balances. It's better to know that there are gaps now rather than in December or January. Your overall owner is going to be able to give you that visibility if you put together the right series of processes and reporting timelines.
So it sounds like testing the data on a regular basis is really a key part of the process.
Absolutely.
All right. That's the information we have to share today. We wanted to go ahead and open up the floor for any questions that our attendees would like to submit. So we'll take a look and see what questions we might have received during the webinar today.
Hey, Mary Beth. Susan, let me get into our control panel here, and I'll pull up those questions for you. Pardon me, folks. All right, it definitely looks like we have some questions that have rolled in over the course of the presentation. So let's tackle our first one. For trailing liabilities, do you help clients assess liability/risk in filing based on, I think that says de minimis levels, and they use the example of company share programs or earnings vested over 3 years with less than $4,000 in company funded? Do you help clients identify, sorry folks, this is a long one, do you help clients identify risk in not filing a tax return if there is no tax liability?
Great question. What we really do on our side is work with the tax provider, and I think Mary Beth talked a little earlier about really having a very strong relationship with the tax provider. A lot of what we do is we structure a program, and from a consulting perspective with our clients, is talk through those what-ifs up front. And then we get the tax provider to sign off on what that risk is, or at least opine on the risk. Oftentimes tax providers won't sign off on lack of compliance, but certainly they'll opine on the risk, they'll give you an assessment of what the pros and cons are, and then the organization finally makes that decision. We are not a tax provider here. We are more focused on recommending business process that really establishes the right approach once your organization makes that determination from a compliance perspective.
Hey, thanks, Susan. Let's move on to our next one. Hey, this audience member wants to know, what do you see as the greatest area of risk in data collection?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and take that one again. For me, it's really about lack of collection and not knowing what's happening. I'll give you a couple of good examples or quick stories. I mean, more and more, and Mary Beth, you can speak to this, more and more of our clients are really moving toward what I like to call, core plus or hybrid approaches. And so each assignment can look very different based upon the business needs, the type of situation, the level of the employee. And so understanding what those commitments are from a benefit perspective on an assignee by assignee basis, the more variety in those packages, the more difficult it is to establish where are my data gaps. We use a lot of analytics, and so when you don't have a consistent policy approach, it becomes very difficult to find trends and outliers, and so it becomes much more labor intensive. So from my perspective, getting some rigor around that reporting and having the right set of checklists and follow-up is really critical.
And Susan, I think to piggyback on that, when we talk about policy, I think that gives us a really good example of how seeing it in the big picture concept is critical, because to your point, when building a policy that has core and flex benefits, it's very important that get communicated broadly within an organization and that everybody is on the same page and understanding how best to document and report the particular benefits that each assignee receives, to ensure that there aren't those gaps in the data collection.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Okay, Susan, Mary Beth, I think I can take this next one. Asking if slides will be available. We did send the slides out before the webinar. However, occasionally they can get caught in a quarantine filter or a spam filter depending on your company's specific firewall. So to this particular audience member, I will definitely make sure that you get your slides. And for anyone else that experienced the difficulty getting the handout in advance of the presentation, just type it in the question and answer box, and I will make sure that that handout is available to everyone as well. Okay, here's our next question. With all the varying elements that need to be reported in various countries, do you recommend a single template for global comp collection across a company? If not, what type of model or models would you recommend?
That's a great question, and we've kind of watched our tools evolve over the years, and normally I think a single template can work depending upon the country and the benefit program. We use something that has kind of a drop down, and all the benefits are available in a drop down, so we try to pre-populate as much of that. The currencies are there so that we can add comments to all of the information. We do use a tool that allows for online data accumulation as well. But we do always have challenges in some countries. They just are. There's language barriers that can't always be overcome. Luckily, we have some resources at Altair. We have 30-plus languages spoken in the organization, and so we'll work with the team and the organization to be able to create prompts that might be language specific. We'll work with our people here to really have those conversations. We use a lot of GoToMeeting where there's a lot of face-to-face with that video, and I really recommend that be an approach. It's very easy to ignore or misunderstand people when it's a communication via email, but you will be amazed at how quickly relationships develop when there's a brief conversation using a video camera or a video call, whether it's some type of business Skype or a GoToMeeting. And people get really familiar very quickly, and then problems start to be resolved. And so for that reason, we do modify our templates, and we would highly recommend that it be situational for you. If it's working, it's fine. If you're having struggles, I think to your point or to your question, the first thing I would consider is, am I asking the question in a way that is understandable to the user?
All right, thank you, Susan. All right, our next question. Do you recommend a global owner as well as process owners for each individual country?
Yeah, absolutely. I really think that you have a global owner of the business process, but you have to have a series of escalations within each country or business unit. You know, I like to call it a friendly reminder process. But when you're 2 weeks late and your data's starting to build, or maybe you're now 2 months late, you've already proven that a polite email is not going to do the trick. And so I always hate to pull out the escalation where people's leadership begins being copied, but it's really important to be able to reach out to your point, a country owner, especially on the financial side, and say, you know, this data hasn't been collected, there's some risk here, we aren't in compliance, we've failed to report, or we're estimating, and we might have a large jump in tax that's going to hit the P&L because of it. That's usually all it takes to get somebody's attention, and then there's a private conversation, and then data starts to flow smoothly.
Given, Susan, just to add on that the compliance risk really isn't just a risk to the employee, but even more so a risk to the organization globally.
Yeah.
I'm sure you would agree that these are situations where that escalation process does need to happen sooner versus later to ensure that the company is in compliance.
Yeah, I mean, I think as with anything in an organization, your leadership team doesn't want surprises, and so they're always happy to step in and help. And I think this is one where they can be of great influence.
Thank you. Let's see our next question here. Under key terms, what is a split payroll versus split delivery?
Yeah, I didn't talk about that, and I was wondering whether I should have done that. So split payroll is where an employee is paid both, some payments in the home and some payments in the host country on their physical payroll. Usually it's done where you need to retain enough money in the home country, to satisfy benefits, pensions, local benefit contributions, and then the remainder is paid in the host country so that it's paid in a local currency. Not many companies are really involved in a split payroll, although the term is used, much like that shadow payroll, interchangeably with split delivery. So split delivery is where the organization makes a decision, and it really, based on that balance sheet methodology, that some benefits are calculated and are actually paid in the host location. So an employee, as an example, might get a goods and services allowance, and that goods and services allowance is going to be delivered in the host location. So that would be considered split delivery, and because it's done that way, because it's really that differential between the home and the host country, and so it's expected that the employee is going to spend it. So we want to deliver it efficiently in the right currency to avoid administrative fees. So that's basically, Mary Beth, do you have anything to add there?
I was just going to say, so really split delivery is not necessarily a split payroll.
Right.
Split delivery could be a single payroll. The split payroll is typically going to be some sort of split delivery.
Right. So. And in some countries, they may take the split delivery, and then I'm going to complicate this, so I forgive you right now. But they may say, we'll take your goods and services, and we're going to run that through the shadow payroll and gross it up. And so you can very quickly see how complicated it can become. Right.
Okay, Susan, here's our next one. What about pensions? These can create a problem due to the taxability on the gain in the United States when there is no tax in the home, especially an issue for local assignments where there is no TEQ. So how would we address that?
Yeah, it's quite complicated. What we do today is we really work with the tax provider. They do an assessment of pensions, and especially foreign pensions for people that are U.S. inbound, as an example, and to really identify what that taxable amount is. If it's non-qualified, obviously there needs to be some income that comes back into the U.S. W-2. Other, U.S. pension plans, typically, if they're not a qualified pension plan, then those compensation elements are typically not assignment related, right? So if there's not a TEQ, then we'd have to ask, what process are you using from, I think, how do I want to explain it, from a filing of taxes? How do you identify what's the employee's percent or portion of the tax owed? So it can get very complicated, and again, not to avoid a specific answer, but that's where we sit down with that tax provider. Mary Beth, spoke so much earlier in the presentation about the importance of the tax provider, and we sit down with your tax and your payroll teams, and we develop the right process. Mary Beth, do you have anything more to add to that?
I was going to say, I think from what I'm hearing, it sounds like there could be a lot of different answers to this. Almost more customized, because it's going to depend on the plan itself, right? The structure of the plan, the home and host combination, and to your point, what calculation, if there is no TEQ, what calculation is being used to determine what the employee's tax responsibility or liability is.
Right, exactly.
Okay, Susan, Mary Beth, looking ahead, it looks like we've got just a couple more questions, so we'll go ahead and address those, and then I've got a brief slide at the end that will explain continuing education credits, and then we can wrap up. So our next to last question that I can see submitted by our audience, we only have 2 people on assignment, and we're not doing anything with shadow payroll. Does every country require a shadow payroll?
No, not every country requires a shadow payroll. So it really depends upon the countries, and if there's a payroll scheme or a tax scheme that requires a pay-as-you-earn process, then your local payroll team will know that, and they will let you know what needs to be done. But the number of assignees doesn't necessarily tell you whether you have to do it or not. Sometimes it can be a threshold of income, just like in the United States, right, with your 941 filings. Depending on how much tax is due, it may be due within 24 hours. It may be due on the 15th of the month following. And so very similar around the globe, your tax provider locally is going to tell you, based upon that volume and activity, how frequently the tax filings need to be made. But just because you have 1 or 2 doesn't mean that you might be exempt from compliance.
All right, thanks, Susan. And here we have what looks like our last question. Let me scroll to it in the window here. Okay. We don't currently have a long-term assignment policy. Each of our business units have outlined what they want to provide on an assignment. There's only been 3 or 4 assignments in the last 2 years. When do you recommend establishing a formal long-term policy, and do we need one for short-term assignments as well?
I'm going to guess Susan's going to let me take this one. So we get this question a lot, and oftentimes we'll have clients say to us, I'm not sure that we need a formal policy because we only have a few assignments per year. And my response to that usually is that even with the smaller volume of assignees, and sometimes even more so, it is important to have some sort of consistent program in place. When you have these low numbers of assignments, sometimes there's more of a risk, because the perception from the business units may be that because there are so few of these, we can just do whatever we want with them. We can customize their benefits and their policies and their programs. And a lot of companies will say, well, I don't see our global volume growing, and typically that's an incorrect statement. It usually does grow in some way, shape, or form. So establishing some sort of formal long-term policy is, I think, critical, if at the very least, just in terms of compliance and the delivery of benefits and ensuring that there's consistency across the board. And in terms of the question of do we need one for short-term assignments as well, absolutely. The short-term assignment structure is somewhat similar to a long-term assignment, but also very different, even more so for short-term assignments, because there are a lot of common misconceptions related to tax liabilities. We hear a lot of companies talk about the 183-day rule, which is not necessarily the case in every country. So it is really important to monitor those short-term assignments and have policies in place, if only for the purpose of understanding where and when you are creating some sort of tax liability.
All right. Thank you, Mary Beth, and thank you, Susan, for taking the time to answer our audience's question. And thank you to the audience for submitting them. Hey, quickly here, I want to just briefly touch on our continuing education credits. Like I said before, this slide is also in the handout you received, so you can use that as a reference. For you worldwide ERC CRP holders, this program has been pre-approved by ERC, so when you apply for your credit, there should be no charge, and your activity's up there. For our human resources HRCI credit holders, this program has been submitted to HRCI, but sometimes they can take a little while to approve them. So we would ask that you allow up to 4 weeks before trying to log in and apply for credit, because I think this is still in their queue to approve for credit, and they just haven't gotten there yet. I'd like to thank everyone for attending today, and definitely thank Susan and thank Mary Beth for compiling and communicating all this great information. I know that I know a whole lot more about this topic than I did when I walked in the room earlier today, and I certainly hope you feel the same way. We recognize that your time is valuable here at Altair, so from all of us here, thank you again for taking the time to attend, and we hope you have a great afternoon. Bye.